Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to another live stream of Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel and video game news. Today is Friday, January 19th, and let's see here. This is basically about the point where people change the channel on my videos, so that's something that irritates me, and I imagine it irritates a lot of content creators in general, is that if you're averaging 30 seconds of watch time and you're assuming that people are jumping in at the beginning, they literally are just hearing a voice, my voice, and turning off. Or they're not instantaneously, and I mean instantaneously, getting satisfied with some kind of visuals and they're turning off. And I would say the YouTube algorithm is not getting better about that. And the way YouTube works in general is just not getting better about that, because there's a lot of watch history that is getting added from the end user's perspective if you just hover over a video, because the video will start to autoplay. I assume that watch history is then being counted as a view and as watch time, so it may be artificially creating larger amounts of views for content creators, but actually significantly decreasing your watch time in the trade-off for that, which is not the direction YouTube should have gone. Although the good news is YouTube and Google are laying off a bunch of people, so we might have a very different company. Doesn't mean it's going to be a better company, doesn't mean it's even going to be a viable company, but it is probably the one thing that could actually affect some change at YouTube. Although inherently that kind of change needs to actually happen from the top, not from the bottom. Laying off a few thousand content moderators out of India is not going to change policy at all at YouTube. The people that need to be laid off are the people who are making poor decisions for content creators and for viewers, even more so. So there's a 10-pack of legacy cards, and not a single one of them was new. So yeah. I suppose they do have to give me accurate information. I'd be more pissed off if they just said watch time averages less than a minute. But yeah, I don't know what you can really do about it. Speaking of not knowing what to do, I, over the past couple days, have just been finishing up scheduling YouTube Shorts, so we're back into the YouTube Shorts business for 2024, at least for a while there. I still have a little bit of scheduling still to do, but that has become certainly another way in which I've avoided working on my smart on-air sign, and I'm just, with every day, getting closer and closer to the danger zone of giving up on the project completely, when I desperately needed to actually finish and actually try and sell it, and I desperately needed to actually sell and make some actual income. And yeah, it might be a fear of failure, or it might just be that it is incredibly frustrating. Let's play with the second deck, since we really didn't get anywhere with the first deck in this event. I was at a point, certainly, where I was watching Farscape on Freebie and letting the macro schedule the YouTube Shorts, and watched several episodes of that. So I went from just watching an old sci-fi show, Eureka, to now an old sci-fi show in Farscape. Farscape in particular is rather bad to watch. It's only available in 4:3 ratio. It's not been remastered or such. It really has just got a very poor treatment overall. which Farscape in particular I think is the one show you could reboot and remake fairly easily without having to run into major problems, because you could always just have a bunch of aliens and one human on the run, and that's the, for the most part, the entirety of the plot of Farscape is that it's just relationships and growing relationships. Although in fairness, the relationship between like the female humanoid bad girl and the human male and the rest of the aliens who are puppets or in costume or makeup at least, they became buddies really fast after that first episode, where it feels like it should have been it should have taken a little bit longer for them to fully trust her and include her in the group. That easily could have been the main arc of the first season of Farscape, really, is that it could have come to a head where it looks like the female protagonist, the humanoid female protagonist, is going to betray everybody else, and then at the end of that final episode of the first season, she proves herself and fully at that point becomes part of the team. The beauty of Farscape amongst any of the other sci-fi shows, and it is perhaps scraping the bottom of the barrel to talk about sci-fi shows in many ways, that it really is a genre that has been very poorly. I turned up the background music because I recorded a solo. Let me turn that down. Sorry about that. I recorded a solo solo play episode. So I actually did make some footage, but that was just because I didn't feel like starting programming in the middle of the night, and I didn't feel like watching yet another episode of Farscape and letting the scheduling go on for a little bit longer. It makes a little bit of a sense to wait a week and then schedule some more videos, but it also really won't change too much if I waited a week. I'm just so far ahead with so many YouTube shorts. There's just going to be 4 or 5 of them a day. But yeah, when you look at like Eureka, a lot of that is just like CGI stuff and prop making, whereas Farscape had the Jim Henson Company involved, although I don't think Jim Henson was alive at the time that Farscape was made. If anything, I think Farscape may have been the step in the right direction that they turned away from as far as post Jim Henson Company, and it really is just like the last use of puppets or just on stage visual effects in sci-fi shows before everything is more focused on just CGI. If you look at what's the name of the Star Trek show that Seth MacFarlane is ripping off, it's not real Star Trek, but it's basically Seth MacFarlane playing Star Trek and putting him in the role of captain, which is the worst part about the series. Yeah, I can't remember the name of the show, but in the show I can't remember the name of, there's a character that's a glob of goo, I think named Yafat, and he definitely strikes me as somebody that really should have just been a human in makeup most of the time and could turn into goo much more like Odo. Although in fairness, Deep Space Nine's makeup for Odo was pretty awful. So yeah, some of the Farscape is kind of ridiculous, where you have just like a Logitech mouse being used as the controller to fly the ship manually, and you have walls that look like they're just foam that have been painted to look like they're bronze metal. But the gadgets don't really matter, because the props don't matter, because the costumes and puppetry of the aliens is top notch. And yeah, I imagine you probably have had in some of the sci-fi shows, I mean Star Trek shows I haven't watched, you probably do have an occasional puppet alien or makeup on an alien that looks better just because of the shows being newer, but there's really no focus on it. You look into the cast and crew of like Star Trek Into Darkness or Picard, and there really is just no creature there on those bridges that isn't just a humanoid with maybe some Vulcan ears added or eyebrows changed. Whereas it would have made a lot more sense to have more of that. But inherently, there are no puppet or makeup companies anymore. They've all been downsized to the point of not existing, and all that skill and talent has really gone away in favor of just doing everything in computer and CGI, which definitely does not last as long. Farscape is a great example of a show that, even though it's 4x3, even though there's been no kind of remaster to get the quality up, and it really does just look like the quality of video you would have seen on a VHS tape or broadcast on TV. When you look at the aliens in Farscape, they still stand up. They still look like aliens. They don't look cartoony. They don't look ridiculous. They don't have that uncanny valley that CGI of the past has had, and even CGI of today has had. How does that connect to video games? It really doesn't. With perhaps the small exception of live action games, of which there aren't very many worth mentioning. But certainly, from a video gamer perspective, most people can recognize that what we thought was acceptable in a Lara Croft in Tomb Raider 1 and thought was actually high levels of 3D graphics is laughably poor quality in 2024, in which we look at the low polygon 3D models of Lara Croft and Tomb Raider 1 and laugh. And even the remasters that we're getting of older games like Tomb Raider 1, 2, and 3, which are getting remastered, still aren't doing amazing jobs of remaking and remastering the visuals. We will be laughing at the remasters of Tomb Raider 1, 2, and 3 10 years from now, as far as just how laughably unrealistic it is. And it is really only going to be a case of a desire for different kinds of art styles that is going to prevent the game industry from going 100% realistic all the time, to the point where video games are going to be so lifelike that they'll be indistinguishable from real world images. But the good news on that aspect is that there is a fairly large amount of demand for different art styles. I don't feel like Bayonetta, for instance, is better served if it was hyper-realistic and less colorful than the way it is depicted. I don't feel like Super Mario games are better served if they became highly realistic, because if they became highly realistic, you would lose, in particular in Super Mario Bros. Games, the bright, colorful color palette. Like, all of a sudden, Mario's bright red hat would become some kind of fabric texture that is a darker, more natural red, crimson hat, and Mario's skin tone and body proportions and everything would have to all just adjust for that reality to the point it would become unrecognizable. Now, noticeably, I think you probably could pull it off a lot more with Zelda games. If you took the Zelda of Tears of the Kingdom and just continuously evolved that to be more realistic, that probably would be accepted, in part because the only thing that really defines Zelda Link in Zelda games is that he's wearing like a green tunic, has a sword and shield. All of those could be easily replicated. The color palette's not that big of a deal. They also broke the color palette in Breath of the Wild anyways, because it was typically more fantasy browns and oranges to begin with, and they went with more of a blue and electric white visuals in a lot of points in Breath of the Wild. So yeah, that's pretty much, I guess, all the accountability section I'm gonna have for today. I did stay up in the middle of the night and start late anyways, because of that. But yeah, scheduling videos, avoiding subconsciously or consciously working on the smart on air sign, and playing a solo mode, which the solo mode I played was super short and very pointless and kind of odd, in particular because it's the UA cards for Ultra Athletes, so all the cards are players of different sports in a sci-fi future version, which just feels like you're not targeting the right audience as far as Yu-Gi-Oh players. Almost every other Yu-Gi-Oh card is like a fantasy monster type thing. There's no thought of sports or real world visuals in pretty much all of the cards you see, and I just can't really imagine that even in Japan there's a large amount of Japanese kids that both are really into sports and playing Yu-Gi-Oh. Now, there probably is a little bit more overlap in Japan because kids in Japan are forced into doing clubs, and a lot of the clubs are sports based, and they have an annual sports festival, at least one. So yeah, almost every Japanese kid, I imagine, has played at least one or two sports. But they also are oddly, weirdly Western sports: basketball, baseball, football. There is no judo, there is no sumo in the cards that I saw, but you would think there would be some mix of that. No karate or anything like that. But yeah, it felt very weird as a card expansion. Of course, it certainly is nowhere as near as like Magic the Gathering having My Little Pony cards for sale at a very high limited amount and high price. I did verify that with another small update, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is back to showing the solo cutscenes if you just stay at the click a button to start menu title screen on Yu-Gi-Oh! So they haven't intentionally gotten rid of that, which, yeah, they've already created it, they might as well use that content. Although I would like to see them 2 years in just say, you know what, we've done enough solo stuff, or severely slow it down so that they don't make that much more. I could see one new solo mode for an actual new expansion of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game. I still don't really have a YouTuber that plays Yu-Gi-Oh! That talks about updates or anything like that, so I assume there are expansions that are happening in the West of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, and so being aware of the actual expansions that are happening in the real world card game would help me better understand these expansions that are getting added, if expansions are getting added to the digital game, and the solo modes that are being added to perhaps highlight it. It definitely feels like it would be better received by me, at least, if there was a solo mode that was added because there was an actual expansion. It was a big celebration. They encouraged or forced everybody to play that solo mode around the time the new card expansion happened, so everybody's aware of the light backstory that exists around that expansion, and then they rewarded the players heavily for playing the solo mode. But it just doesn't feel like that's what's really going on. It definitely feels way more like the solo modes are just being added because it's out of obligation and out of some false sense of obligation. So this themed Chronicle event, I've really only had success by having network disconnects at the beginning. So far, I don't believe I've actually played an entire game through in one. Which, in part, I have to take some of the blame for that, in that I'm just not willing to engage as much. I really should think about just doing Sudokus instead. It is certainly a thought that I should experiment with, and the problem here is I don't have enough viewers or subscribers to really just run a poll and get any feedback. I could get one, maybe two people who would say, yes, do it, don't do it. But it really would come down to, am I getting the 15 to 20 views playing Sudoku versus playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And certainly if I did go into Sudoku, that would be just inherently admitting defeat with Yu-Gi-Oh! And abandoning it. Although, I would say I could probably take a decent break from Yu-Gi-Oh! And still come back later. Whereas Magic the Gathering in particular was very terrible about that, and if you took a break for even 2 or 3 months, you've pretty much ruined any chances of maintaining your rank or maintaining momentum. But yeah, if I fell down with my Zodiac Tri-Brigade deck all the way to the lowest rank, so if I toss a card in the graveyard, so can I do anything from this? 2 zombie monsters, 2 zombie monsters, 2 monsters. Okay, so I'm gonna activate it. Guess we activate this. Then we change the level. Of our zombie monster. That did absolutely nothing for me. See, this is kind of the same problem I was having with the solo modes, and it's particularly frustrating because you're playing against AI in the solo modes, where you'll have people with very similar, if not the exact same decks, and yet your opponent can just totally wreck you. Just because they are luckier or better at playing those decks. If I did experiment with the Sudokus though, it also is very possible that, at least at the beginning, I'd be very interested in solving the Sudoku puzzles and not talk about video game news as fast. The real solution is to have some kind of warm-up exercise that happens off-air and then immediately jump into video game news. But I don't know what that warm-up exercise really should be for me, or what would work there. So the developer direct happened and they talked about the games, and it doesn't seem like much of anything else was talked about, so no big surprises there. It doesn't seem like any of them even came out and said anything like games are going to, all the games are going to be multi-platform or something like that. So it does very much, for that presentation, feel like everything is staying pretty much the same. They talked about 4 games. The 4 games we know are going to be on the Xbox, they may be on PC, and they may even be on other platforms. But we do have a Video Games Chronicle article here that brings up an interesting question. In the headline saying Xbox's Indiana Jones games revealed featuring Harrison Ford's likeness, but Ford won't be supplying the character's voice. Which, in all fairness, I don't really believe that Harrison Ford's voice really sounds like Harrison Ford's voice back in previous decades when he was playing Indiana Jones proper in the first 3 movies. But it does bring about an interesting question, because what Indiana Jones game hasn't attempted to emulate Harrison Ford's likeness? At no point, even playing Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, which is just an 8-bit pixely sprite of Indiana Jones, at no point did I feel like that wasn't Harrison Ford being depicted there, and that they had some secondary way in which they were drawing a character. Now contrast that to, say, James Bond. James Bond has been portrayed by multiple actors, so I could easily see making a James Bond game and having James Bond look like just some random character design that doesn't emulate any of the actors. But in most of the James Bond games, even they were going for one of 2 or 3 James Bond actors to represent James Bond. The animation style there for those older games were just particularly poor. And I can't really imagine that you would want to try and redefine what Indiana Jones looked like, even if Harrison Ford has already passed away. But I definitely do feel like the trick there is to continue to make Indiana Jones look and feel like Harrison Ford. Now, as far as the voice, I'm not sure that Harrison Ford did the voice in Fate of Atlantis. I think he did, but certainly enough things have changed where Steven Spielberg and George Lucas aren't just making handshake deals to get Harrison Ford to be a voice actor, and I imagine Harrison Ford would want a decent amount of money to voice act himself in a video game if he wants to engage with that at all, which he may very well not want to engage with that at all. I think for the most part Harrison Ford has long since wanted to retire and is just being brought back by popular demand or contractual obligations. Noticeably, he has managed to be killed off. His characters have managed to be killed off both in Star Trek, Star Wars, and I assume he dies at the end of Dial of Destiny. If he doesn't die, he's certainly old enough to wrap up that story. And with the death of Indiana Jones being the title character, it does make a lot of sense to just make other shows, other movies. That people really failed to rip off Indiana Jones and have other kinds of adventurers rip them off, other than say like the Librarians, which they did a very decent job. There's a Librarians TV series. There was never an Indiana Jones type TV series. There's at least 5 Librarians movies, all of which, well, maybe not great, or equally worth watching, where there's really only 3 Indiana Jones movies worth watching. It's to broaden the thought. Is there another character that has been brought to video games whose likeness is being emulated? I can't immediately think of one, but I suspect there probably is something out there that's been brought to video games. James Bond obviously has been brought to video games in several games, but all the Marvel and DC video games are really more based off the likenesses and appearances of the comic book characters, and they've really gone out of their way to make sure that the characters don't really look too much like the actors. I wouldn't say that the Harley Quinn in Suicide Squad is Margot Robbie, which also it seems like Margot Robbie playing Harley Quinn is done at this point, with James Gunn now being in charge of DC and just trying to go in a different direction. We'll see if any of that succeeds. But there is some oddity, I would say, in that we just don't really have a Jack Reacher character who would have been a much more recent hero. Yeah, it definitely feels like that would have been a step to go, is to have some Jack Reacher characters. Obviously, in the Lara Croft games, none of them are trying to make Lara Croft look like Angelina Jolie or the other actress who I can't even name. I guess inherently, to wrap up this thought, I don't see I just don't really see a reason to try to make characters look like real human actors or actresses. I guess they're all just going by actors now. Because particularly after Harrison Ford, he's pretty much the last iconic, one of the last iconic actors anyways. None of the newer, younger actors have that feel. I probably could have won that there, come to think of it. I could have attacked with this, then activated this ability, and then increased the attack and won. The real hope here, though, is that it doesn't become a situation where the voice doesn't match the face, and it's just extremely off-putting. As for the Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, it seems like so far it sounds good and the visuals here look good enough. You are back in the past where Indiana Jones is young, you're fighting against Nazis, you're not fighting against Russians, or even later in the timeline, which moving the timeline forward didn't make a lot of sense for the movies. I doubt you're going to see Mutt or any super important secondary character. It would be a mistake, in my opinion, particularly in the video games, to try and introduce a new character to replace Indiana Jones for the video games, because the video games are certainly the one form in which this series can continue. Wow, I didn't know Ash Blossom was a zombie. That is some level of craziness. Do we want to do anything here? No, the only real options would be to summon this. Or to summon this. We'll see if this works, I guess. This is very much a zombie focused thing. So if you can get a handle on the zombie thing, the zombie style of gameplay, you can win with that. But I think you have to get kind of lucky too. Slowly making progress now, finally. Okay, so it seems like for a while here I'll be reporting more directly from refused classifications. Another video game called Grotto has been banned by Australia's under the Automated International Age Rating Coalition system. Although the fact that it has automated in the name definitely makes it feel like there are just people, game developers and publishers, who are going to some website, filling out the information, and then getting a response that it has been refused classification. And I think this is almost certainly an automated. You almost always will get rejected if there's any problems at all, and then you have to fight it in some more formal proceedings. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some games that automatically get refused and then a couple weeks later are approved. But that is perhaps a great example of, if you're going to have an automated system like that, have a process that just says more review needed instead of refused classification. Because just by default rejecting and not having a next step, it gives off a very negative feeling and feels more draconian than it probably needs to be. You could lose a lot of games in committee, certainly, if you just said you needed more information, you needed more details, and then say that the rating is pending because of all of that, when the game would still never likely get approved if it really is so offensive to Australians. Yep. According to this tweet, you will be headbutting Nazis, punching Nazis, outwitting Nazis, shooting Nazis, and whipping Nazis in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. So it does seem to me, looking at this, that it's probably the main bad guy. This looks like this is the female lead, and it looks like there's going to be a fight, and it looks like they may introduce a assistant friend to Indiana Jones. Arguably, I would say they're making Indiana Jones perhaps a little too young, even compared to the Indiana Jones we see in the Last Crusade. Because even then he was a little bit rougher and had a little bit more wrinkles. But this is just also one piece of art, so it's not the totality of the visuals. Here we have a good comparison, I think, of visuals to consider too. Very much in line about what I was talking about, where as we continue to try to make things look better, it sometimes doesn't actually succeed. So BioWare talking about Mass Effect 1, effectively, trying to maintain the goodwill around the Mass Effect series, despite the fact that Andromeda and Mass Effect 3 basically already has ruined all the goodwill there. But also, I guess they really just don't have anything else they can offer at the moment, so totally stupid plan. But here you have a direct comparison between the original and, I assume, the Legendary Edition remaster, and I would argue that the original looks a little bit better in the lighting department overall, and it definitely feels like you can tweak things, but that just makes slight changes. Now, undoubtedly, completely redoing the textures of the outfit here is better than the more simplified texture here. And I'd even say redoing the textures on the face is better than the face of this alien. But that's where the Uncanny Valley, in particular, is going to be at its least challenging. The comparison between this face, which has shadows and darkness, perhaps a little bit too much shadow, so it feels kind of muddy and the color palette's not great. I would still say that the faces of these two humans with the shadowing looks better than the overly brightly lit faces of these two humans. Now, the hair techniques have been tweaked here, and so the hairs look a little bit better in the remastered version, but overall I can't say it's a 100% improvement. Now the backgrounds here with the lighting look way better, but do you really even need the backgrounds to be better lit in most situations? Or are you just wasting resources and dragging away people's attention? I think I may have to stop playing a little early here, because I want to really just talk about the news and I don't want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Now I will say, I could see where some people like the better lit and possibly slightly better textured outfits of the two humans. But honestly, the darkness of this and the lighting of this in the original version is, I think, way better. And a lot of the difference in color here and brightness may just be a shift between having a brightness scale that would have been designed for NTSC standard TVs versus having a brightness scale that went up for computer monitors, which have a few more colors and a bit brighter in its focus. Is definitely isn't getting to the point where it's high dynamic range colors or anything like that. And if you were to put high dynamic range into Mass Effect, there is a decent chance that you would have this desire to just push forward to even a more brighter, even more colorful, cartoony vision of it. Which overall, this feels cartoony. This feels like this is an effort to be serious, and I would say Mass Effect was trying to be serious, but this feels like this is a 3D CGI cartoon of Mass Effect for some kind of direct-to-streaming service like Netflix. Yeah, there's definitely a danger in trying to remaster things and tweak things. Of course, if you were to, in the Legendary Edition, they did just like reduce the loading, and nobody complained about that. Nobody's going to complain that the very long loading in elevators in Mass Effect should have been there. No significant number of people will complain about that. Somebody will complain about everything. But with a remaster like that, you're dangerously close to having somebody then mod the old visuals back in, or somebody wanting just a non-visual remaster or port or patched version of the original game. Of course, you can't easily sell a game that looks exactly the same but plays a little bit better and loads faster. And eventually you will get, even Mass Effect will get an audience of people who are really remembering their own nostalgia and have false memories of what Mass Effect 1 was, and then you'll be able to sell them on some new game that looks way different but feels like the nostalgic version, the memory. It feels like the false memory of what Mass Effect is. And in fairness, that is the direction they should go with Mass Effect 2. If they also, if they are going to revive the Mass Effect series. But then I also would argue that they probably shouldn't revive the Mass Effect series. They should give it a different name and maybe set it in the same universe. But there is also the things that the decisions and the gameplay styles that Mass Effect eventually became are not that far away from something like Starfield or No Man's Sky. So that they may have established just a new style of genre slightly different than other role-playing sci-fi games that would have existed before Mass Effect, but they didn't establish anything super interesting in the Mass Effect universe. You could bring back the aliens, those specific alien species that are in Mass Effect. You could bring back the politics of the Mass Effect worlds. You can bring back the weapons. But I think you dropped the name Mass Effect. And you probably should make something a little bit shorter, a little bit simpler, and instead of trying to make giant games that go on for too long, just scale down the ambition quite a bit. And if you get rid of the Mass Effect names, that helps quite a bit in that direction. Although inherently they can't really do anything with Mass Effect because they just don't seem like they've maintained a good enough level of skill to make games in general after Mass Effect Andromeda. We are in a different position, I think, now too, where people just aren't willing to overlook bugginess as much. So we're at 3,300 medals. We want to get to 5,500. This ends on the 28th, so this one goes for a while at least. Meanwhile, as far as missions go, we're making progress on that, and we've done everything except for these two. Fusion summon, pendulum summon, link summon, destroy a card. Notice here I don't have play solo because I did a solo mission story, and in that I unlocked this tournament athletes deck, which is a pretty good target to buy cards, and now that I have a little bit more gems, I think I will just buy a 10-pack here. Hopefully I'll get one ultra rare. Yes. And as such, I don't delve too deep into, particularly in this set of cards, it's a case where I would need 3 or 4 of those kinds of cards for it to make sense. You're not just going to play one FA test run and nothing else in a deck. You're going to have UA Stadium and cards of that same genre. Let's speed up this process though. So not bad. I got 3 ultra rares, but I am very much just buying these cards to fill in gaps of cards I don't have before. I would still really like there to be more information as far as just when did these cards get made and released. That is totally missing. But yeah, there's just a lot of weirdness around the UA cards, and then the other cards that they're adding here just don't really connect at all to it. And that is the problem with a lot of these solo stories and these expansions in general, is that there's only about 10 cards that stick to the theme, and then you have decks that are playing things that don't make any sense at all, like Sacred Phoenix, or Water Dragon, or Superconductor Tyranno. Like, you would think all these cards would be in that UA theme. And the FA, I imagine, maybe stands for Future Athletes, and seems to be more around racing. Seems like this expansion is working towards that Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime series where they were racing and playing Yu-Gi-Oh! At the same time. Of course, in the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, pretty much in all of them, it's pretty obvious that people only play Yu-Gi-Oh! And they don't play any other kinds of games or any other kinds of sports at all. And they are just obsessed with Yu-Gi-Oh! But yeah, this expansion very much comes off like it's a go outside and touch grass argument being made from Yu-Gi-Oh! Which the last thing they want you to do is go outside and touch grass. So, 1 tin pack there, I'm hoping is good enough to satisfy me. There's still a decent number of cards here, though, that I don't have 2 copies of, don't have 3 copies of, or don't even have 1 copy of. But then there is a case here where I already have a pretty decent number of super rares and ultra rares. Where these other expansions, there's a decent chance I already have a lot of them. See, I would say there's a better argument to open this pack up, 10 packs of this, and go for the super rares and ultra rares, because I could use crafting points just to get the normals instead. And getting all these cards really just doesn't mean anything. I'd say this is a bad candidate because we already have a decent number of super rares and ultra rares. Alright. Of course, I open a 10 pack here. It's just gonna find new cards and then open up more secret packs. And it's just gonna keep going down that direction. Whoops, I didn't mean to right click there. But I quickly noticed we got some decent super rares there, and this definitely isn't a candidate for buying another 10 pack. Really, it would be somewhat silly to buy another 10 pack at all. But we'll look at these last 3 and just see. This isn't a good candidate. This isn't a good candidate either. There's real weirdness here that there's never really a time where it feels like you should dump a ton of gems to buy cards. There is instead just kind of a constant desire. This might be a good candidate just because there's such a high number of super rares and ultra rares, but then also most of these are fusion cards that you almost certainly would never play. So there's a limitation in that also. But yeah, you would think for a collectible card game that they would come out with a new normal pack and they would make it very much the case that you absolutely felt the need to buy cards from the new normal pack. And yeah, it just doesn't feel like that's the case. And I'd assume that these normal cards are probably the newest cards being added, or these normal cards are the newest cards being added. Neither one of these packs are good candidates to spend gems on. So yeah, you just don't really have that sense of urgency that you would think you would have. We have 18 more days of ranked, the gold pass to play, and yeah, I'm at gold 1, so unless I got really lucky or played a lot of extra Yu-Gi-Oh, which I shouldn't waste my time doing, I'm not gonna get the diamond. I'll get the platinum. Alright, let's talk about the news then, because I think I'm done with Yu-Gi-Oh for today. Here we have a GameDeveloper.com article talking about War Hospital's card system and what developers can learn by tackling morality, or what they can learn from morality systems from War Hospital's card system. This is effectively an opinion piece that is secretly an advertisement for War Hospital, which would be great and all except for the fact, let's see if I click on this, if it'll take me to Steam, that people are not particularly happy with War Hospital, which makes your opinion piece advertisement fairly irrelevant. The last time I looked at this, the problem with War Hospital is it's just not got a good gameplay system. You're effectively, it's a very shallow thing. The gameplay loop becomes very boring, and there's perhaps some level to that would be very difficult to fix. Inherently, the game looks like it is very much a resource management game. It doesn't, I think, have in-app purchases, so good on it for that, but you really are just managing resources. But in this case, the resources are going to be patients in hospitals, and there's just a lot of timers and slowdowns that maybe aren't necessary at all. And see, inherently, if this was going to be like the other hospital game, the silly hospital game that came out a couple years ago, then management games would make more sense in that silly theme. But you can't have that silly theme and call it War Hospital, more than likely. Nobody would appreciate that if you were joking around that. So you need random events, and it doesn't seem like there really are any random events in this game. There would have to be a power outages, tsunami, floods, things like that occurring to become challenges to give you something to do. And even at that, it still doesn't quite feel like the kind of game that you could enjoy in the long run. And maybe that is just the theme in general, is that it's a little too depressing overall. It almost certainly would be a better idea to have a game like Saboteur, which I really hate that they never ported or re-released Saboteur as a game, because that actually was a pretty great game for its time. But yeah, if you were playing as an individual character who was a saboteur, who was hiding in the war hospital, which probably is against the Geneva Convention and a really bad idea anyways, because if people are hiding in the war hospitals, then the war hospitals will be targeted for attack. But whatever. If you are some kind of action player and half of your missions are running around the countryside during a war, like sabotaging, attacking people, shooting people, doing those very basic gameplay things that you expect from your average first-person, third-person shooter, and then the war hospital was the secondary game mechanic, I think that could work. If all of a sudden you're sabotaging things or stealing gold for the war hospital so that they can get resources, you're stealing bandages, medicine, things like that, and that gets you more resources, and then you have some management that you do of the war hospital, but for the most part it just automates itself, that would get more of an audience, I imagine, instead of just being a pure management game. Of course, that also drastically changes what the game is. I think maybe there's a mistake in the fact that there is a card system as a way of depicting things. I had similar problems with Darkest Dungeon, in that Darkest Dungeon's main gameplay loop of attacking felt fairly disconnected from the village section, and I actually think I may have enjoyed the village section a little bit more, but I wasn't really getting rewarded enough for the village section in between the dungeon runs of Darkest Dungeon. Of course, the biggest problem with Darkest Dungeon is that it's just way too difficult. But yeah, I could see something similar to that, where you would go on maybe randomly or semi-randomly generated missions, and then you would come back to the war hospital and manage things, improve your stats, improve the people you might have on your team. But in its current state, the reality is that war hospital is just not really being well received. Now, somebody put out a survey, and so Video Games Chronicle is reporting on some of the results of this survey. Nearly 50% of developers say that generative AI tools are being used at their workplace. A large majority say they're concerned about the ethics of using such tools. So this is yet again, I think, a great example of capitalism perhaps corrupting way faster than ethics or rules or laws can be put in place. The general assumption by CEOs and managers that AI would save them money or eventually just make them money has led to the entire industry to play follow the leader, and everybody's jumping off the bridge without looking into AI for fear that they get left behind and that they would be the one video game company that's still working on the old expensive budgets where everybody else is working on much cheaper budgets. Now, if there was a bunch of small indie video game companies out there, they probably would still, at the same rate, try and use generative AI, but maybe slightly fewer individual single game developers would use AI if the individual game developer doesn't has a moral objection to it. It is very possible, and let me just throw out a potential scenario in the future that the ideas of using things like generative AI will be considered bad, if not illegal, and the only way you could curb something like that is to try to regulate it and penalize people who break the regulation, or reward people in some way for not breaking the regulation. And certainly, if we could create a system where people would just get grants to make video games, or if we started to see GoFundMes that required you to, or I guess they wouldn't be GoFundMes, they'd be Kickstarters that required you to promise and submit records to prove you're not using AI, we could curb it that way. But the reality, the real situation that almost certainly will happen is very quickly there's going to be one major lawsuit that happens where somebody releases a video game using AI, and then somebody sues that video game company for copyright infringement, and it ruins the video game company and just sends them directly into bankruptcy because of that. And we have had that similar situation happen, not because of use of AI, but because of use of an engine that's what it was argued was not paid for, in the case of the game Too Human, which every single copy of the game Too Human was ordered to be destroyed, which means if you do have a copy of Too Human on your shelf, it is a finite resource more than most. They can never remake or remaster Too Human. They probably couldn't even make a game called Too Human because there was so much controversy around the lawsuit there anyways, which is a shame because I think the story and narrative of Too Human was very interesting, and they could certainly try that again. It had basically like a Warhammer 40k feel, but with Nordic gods. And it definitely has been at least a decade since Too Human has gone away, so it is kind of surprising that there isn't a Warhammer 40k style ripoff of Too Human. But yeah, capitalism in general is 100% focused on making money, so if anything looks like it will make money, they will do it as soon as possible. They will not think about the ethics of it at all, and nothing can really slow it down. This is perhaps an argument that laws should be passed very quickly to say, hey, there just needs to be a moratorium on using AI generated content, or there should just be laws on the book that says you can't do certain things unless pre-approved by certain organizations. In this case, it would be the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress probably does legally have the authority to put out a ruling to say you cannot use AI generated art in your content at some level. They have already said AI generated art can't be copyrighted, so that they have said if these video games come out and they have AI generated art in them, they already are potentially losing copyright, which apparently 50% of developers are not concerned about that, which seems crazy. Clearly the intention here is for the 50% of developers to secretly use AI, when it's so far been pretty easy to identify AI generated art when it's being used. So they're hoping to get away with something that they almost certainly won't get away with. Also, a third of developers saw layoffs at their workplace last year, and 56% of them worry it'll happen this year. Which, yeah, there definitely doesn't seem like there's any reason why the layoffs would slow down at this point. There's a small reason. Once you get out of fiscal first quarter, there might be a small reason why you'd see slowdowns, but clearly layoffs are the name of the game for 2023 and early 2024, and the industry in itself is just bloated. And then you're seeing layoffs outside of the game industry too. You're just seeing it all over the place. And yeah, economies are bad, and the idea of at least one adult male husband working is becoming less and less stable as a concept. There's just fewer and fewer jobs that are truly needed, and yet there's the exact same, if not more, need to have food, clothing, and shelter. And those two things just cannot forever balance out. Like, if they could balance out, we wouldn't have homelessness at all, or poverty or bankruptcy. The United States Biden administration is forgiving a lot of student loans for a lot of college degrees that are proving to be very useless, but we can't, even in that, expect people to go back and get more education for degrees that often are useless. We are just taking those difficult steps slowly towards a more automated, if not fully automated, society where one worker per is capable of making enough money to take care of an entire family, and one worker is not often even needed by companies. One of the things at CES they definitely talked about was slight expansions of drones delivering things from whether it's food or packages from Amazon, from Walmart, from CVS and drugstores, and so we are slowly working towards drones replacing many delivery jobs. Most of the packing and shipping jobs are starting to see robots take over those positions, and there aren't really new jobs coming about. That is often the argument that is made, is that for every one job that becomes automated by a computer, there's a new job that is created for somebody to then monitor and debug the robots, and it's just not the case. There, for every 1,000 jobs that a robot in automation replaces, there might be one programming job that's created. They wouldn't be doing it if it was just a one-to-one trade-off. There is some slight progress as far as like self-checkout, in that people's absolute rejection and hate of self-checkout seems to have finally pushed companies to start to remove and reduce the number of self-checkout counters, but I imagine we'll still see one or two of them around. And the self-checkout stations, in particular at grocery stores and retail stores, in a lot of ways probably succeeded greatly financially for the companies, because they could have laid off the most expensive, most senior checkout people, and now when they hire new checkout people, they can just hire them at minimum wage. So you really only had to replace the old people that had gotten raises, that had more seniority. Moving on back to video games, otherwise I will ramble on about the sorry state of the economy in the United States, at least, although throughout the world it seems all fairly similar. Video Games Chronicle says Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 will be a digital-only release costing $50, and the game will have a similar length to its predecessor. It's a sad statement that we are now at the point that a digital release comes with absolutely no real discount, assuming you suspect that games should cost about $50, whereas many people are now trying to push games up into the $60 and $70 price. And so maybe they're making an argument that you're saving $10 by getting a digital only release. Of course, with digital only releases, that means the game can be updated or deleted, or you could lose access to it completely, way easier than a disc version. This definitely feels like this is an experiment by Microsoft to try to push to more of an all digital future. I would also say that the first Hellblade game was kind of short, so there is also an argument for it to be closer to $40 than $50. And I would also generally point out that my impression of Hellblade 1 is that it very much felt like it was a cinematic experience with minimal gameplay and minimal interaction. Very simplistic puzzles, and it maybe a little bit of fighting, and that's about it. I'm not sure you actually fought that much at all. It all very much came off as if it was a bunch of theater kids trying to do a theater play, and yet wrapping it around a video game to sell it to a different audience that may not really be that interested in it. It definitely felt like it was a critical darling Hellblade 1, but I'm not sure that many people, real gamers, were actually playing it. But yeah, I imagine this is also a admittance that they know you're not going to see like 3 million units selling of Hellblade 2 in the first 6 months. They probably will never tell us numbers for the game, but they almost certainly know that this is a niche product, and it will just be a niche product. It is an interesting example, though, of a game really trying to push the graphics to being hyper realistic and sacrificing everything else about a game in that favor. And it's an interesting example of how I just don't think that's going to work anymore. It is the modern attempt of making a full motion video. Back in the day, for like the Sega CD, full motion videos were an interesting gimmick, to say the least, because there were no graphics that looked anything like real video. Hellblade is still rotoscope / animated with face capture, but it is definitely going with a color palette and an art style to make it look as realistic as possible. But that gimmick just does not sell games anymore, because you're approaching the uncanny valley more and more with every attempt you do to make something look realistic. I honestly doubt that there will ever be a point where we can make graphics that are so good that the uncanny valley stops being a thing. I think we'll always, regardless of the best level of graphics, we'll always be able to tell, and we'll always feel like it should be a little bit better. If it does get to a point where it's so good that you can't tell, or that people just say, well, that's good enough, so stop making it any better, we're probably at that point hitting a level at which deepfakes just can't be determined from reality by people, and we're going to have to institute extra programs that will scan video to determine whether this is a real video versus it being a deepfake. GameDeveloper.com has an article here that there's an update that Dead by Daylight developer Behavior has confirmed layoffs. So increasingly we have more layoffs due to changing market conditions as their excuse this time. The problem with all of these layoff announcements is that you really only need to read the headlines. Cuts apparently impacted less than 3% of the workforce. But yeah, nobody has ever come out with an article saying yes, there were layoffs at this company, but here's the weird reason why, or here's the excuse that actually makes some sense and that people would actually feel good about excusing layoffs. It's always market changes conditioned, or we gambled too much investing in one field versus the other, or games didn't sell well enough. Like, it would be frankly a little refreshing if a CEO came out and said, I'm laying off 100 people because I'm a jerk and I wanted another yacht. But yeah, that no CEO really would say that. Here, GameDeveloper.com has got another opinion piece here of replacing the phrase Metroidvania, which has been around for decades, and making the argument that there should be a new term, which there really is just no reason to replace a term people already understand. Even combining what would have been the original Metroid and the original Castlevania made sense back then, but it definitely doesn't make a ton of sense now when you think about like what is the most recent Castlevania game and Metroid Prime games, which are really not Metroidvania games at all. They are, if anything, you'd call these 3D Metroidvania games. But I've never heard anybody suggest anything shorter than Metroidvania. You could certainly describe them as tile-based object collection or tile-based RPG side-scrolling hack and slashes. But then they're not all hack and slashes because Metroid is shooting, so it would be a side-scroller of some sort. So yes, you could call it an RPG side-scroller, but that's longer than saying Metroidvania, and it doesn't fully encompass the idea. We don't call 2D scrolling platformers Mario games or Mario Sonic games. In fairness, no term like that really applied, although back in the day there was a significant percentage of games that were 2D side-scrolling games, and that was just what a lot of NES games were, so there didn't need to be a huge term. We don't call adventure games Zelda games, but Metroidvania has stuck. And like all words, the meaning of words is determined by the populace, so it's often determined by random factors and just general silly decisions. So somebody making an opinion piece to make an argument to change it isn't really going to cause any changes at all. This is a filler article from Game Developer, if you've ever seen one. Something that just is not really that necessary and could be retweeted multiple times throughout the year for multiple years, because it will always be the same opinion and always be the same argument, and it will go nowhere. Let's see. The GameDeveloper.com says the outsourcing studio Obelisk has netted $2 million to create an original horror title. Its studio previously worked on notable projects including Fallout 76, Call of Duty Vanguard, and Sons of the Forest. So it seems to me like they have a decent chance of making a horror game, although I'm not sure $2 million is quite enough. It definitely feels like $2 million gets you only slightly better than Sons of the Forest, and probably nowhere close to the network management that you would need for Fallout 76 or the level of content you would need for a Call of Duty game. There is definitely a thought in my mind that most outsourcing studios are forever doomed to just be outsourcing studios, which can keep people employed, certainly, and keep people in work, but it's hard to get enough money to set some aside to make your own project, or have enough time to set some time aside to have your own project, versus what will almost certainly be a very large demand for outsourcing with all the layoffs happening. I imagine 2024, with the layoffs, will be very good for outsourcing studios once game development starts to actually happen and people realize they've laid off way too many employees. Video Games Chronicle says 8% of developers in a GDC survey say they're working on Nintendo's next console, and 32% said Switch is successful is the platform that most interests them, which both of those numbers are fairly low. 32% is basically a dead even split between the Xbox, the next Nintendo console, and the PlayStation 5. Assuming they're not including PC, it's a little bit of a better number if they're including PC and other. But yeah, Nintendo almost certainly wants more developers working on Nintendo's next console, but perhaps it's a case Nintendo just hasn't given the software development kits to a lot of companies yet in fear of leaks. Perhaps Nintendo is thinking that games will just be very easily ported to the next console anyway, so a game designed to run on the Switch will just very easily be designed to run on the Switch too. Although it may also be a case that if they do just release a more powerful Switch 2, that it won't really change that much, and all games will still come out for the Switch anyways, and that the Switch 2 is just going to be a more powerful, upgraded, more expensive version of the Switch. I don't know if it would sell particularly well if it doesn't make some big changes, but frankly, for 3 generations, it's been a case where Nintendo has, in my opinion, needed to make big changes, and they really have not gone in the right directions. Yes, the Wii sold a ton, but it also ruined what Nintendo consoles were up until that point. The GameCube was the beginning of what an Xbox and a PlayStation would be. The Wii is a toy with waggle tricks that are fun to play with for a while, but certainly didn't last into the Wii U, and definitely didn't help improve the Nintendo Switch. So yeah, I would want to see their next console be much closer to the GameCube in controller style and the types of games made for the platform than for the Wii. With their controller style and the types of games that were made for the Wii. A significant number of Wii games were not really video games, and not video games worth mentioning or playing outside of the couple of first-party ones. So here is some charts which will give us more information if we scroll down. Which platforms are you developing on your current project? 66% are going PC, so clearly the move is to go to PC gaming if you ever needed an argument there. But yeah, we just really aren't having that situation where games are being developed for PC and then publishers are saying we're going to make it a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox exclusive. I don't think either Xbox or Sony are really paying for that kind of exclusivity, so there isn't a PC version. If you need a console, PS5 obviously is the right choice, but the amount of development is fairly equal between the Xbox and the PlayStation. There is less interest in Android, but not really that much less. There's actually quite a bit of interest in Android and iOS, beating out even the Nintendo Switch. Then the rest of these are just previous generation things, except for the Mac. No real desire for Mac, no real desire for VR headsets, no real desire to play directly on the web browser. Then Nintendo Switch successor is even lower than web browser. Although Linux is actually catching up for the Nintendo Switch survivor. But you just really wouldn't ever make a game for Linux and call it Linux, because you just call it PC at that point. And you'd almost always make a game to run on Windows first, and then make a port for Linux, or see if the Proton compatibility layer can work with your Linux Steam OS. Cloud services, very low. Augmented reality, very, very low. Tabletop games in the real world, and Netflix, and let's see, what UGC platforms like Roblox and Minecraft. Playdate very low, and other at 4%. So there is a fairly large drop off once you get to the Nintendo Switch. Even it's about 5 points drop off there. And then this says 16%, but this also says 16%, so I guess the bars are above. Yeah, that's weird the way they made this chart. The text should be at the top and the bar should be below, obviously. But yeah, you have a 6-point drop from Mac to VR headsets, and then it's just a large amount. Although clearly the major winner here is PC. Yeah, Steam Deck perhaps is not the best way. Getting a Steam Deck OLED version is perhaps not the best way to exclusively play games on the PC. You probably should have a gaming computer first and foremost, of some level of quality. A decent medium tier gaming computer, I would say, first and foremost, before thinking about Steam Deck. But I do think, particularly for kids, you might get away with just getting a Steam Deck. Even a fairly cheap refurbished LCD version of the Steam Deck may open a huge level of new games to younger kids, particularly if you have a large Steam library anyways. Let's see, GTA Online's Rockstar Editor is losing its last-gen support. Since GTA Online's PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions is turning 10, Rockstar is eliminating the in-game editor for the systems. So the games are not getting better with time by any means. Hogwarts Legacy is the first non-Call of Duty or Rockstar game to top US sales in 15 years, while the PS5 led hardware sales last year. So the number one in 15 years has either been a Call of Duty or a Rockstar GTA game effectively, and to break that number one spot is questionable how important that is, but it does, I think, spell a difference in opinion of what your average gamer is, because clearly there was this large amount of gamer bros that have started to soften in favor of a either new audience or a changed audience that is willing to embrace something like Hogwarts Legacy and Harry Potter versus Grand Theft Auto, driving cars, shooting guns, and robbing hookers, or Call of Duty, running and gunning in military gaming. It also very possibly is more of a statement around the just degrading quality of Call of Duty and Rockstar games in general, and just the fact that Rockstar games in particular are not super popular. Although I'm making an assumption here that as I scroll down is actually wrong, because it was actually Rock Band that was the last non-Call of Duty Rockstar game to achieve success before this in 2008. So Hogwarts Legacy definitely in that same vein. Overall, the list here, this is a blurry list. Let's see if I click on it. Is that much better? Not really. Zooming in doesn't work either. We'll just go over this. It's number 1 Hogwarts Legacy, then Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, then Madden 24, then Marvel Spider-Man 2, then Tears of the Kingdom, then Diablo 4, which I'm surprised Diablo 4 is that high, then Modern Warfare 2 instead of 3, then Mortal Kombat 1. I'm a little surprised that's that high instead of Jedi Survivor. I'm a little surprised that's not lower. 2, EA Sports Football Club still doing very well in the 10th spot. Starfield extremely high. We're seeing Resident Evil 4 make the 13th spot, which you almost deserve extra points when you're talking a horror game, because there's just a large percentage of people that are assumed to never be willing to play horror games. MLB The Show, 14th spot. Dead Island 2, surprisingly, in the 15th spot, beating out all of those games, beating out Final Fantasy 16, which I imagine drives Square Enix crazy. I did hear Square Enix says that they're going to make fewer games to hopefully improve the quality of what they release. Fighting game taking the 17th spot on Street Fighter 6. Elden Ring taking the 18th spot. Mario Kart 8, and then Minecraft taking the 20th spot. And this is the sales, the amount of money they've made in just general sales, gross revenue. None of these games are particularly more expensive than the others either, and not a lot of these games have significant amounts of in-app purchases, although some of them definitely do. I imagine if you had Counter-Strike Go listed, or what they're calling, whatever they renamed it to, the amount of sales there would always have it in the number 1 spot, but Valve isn't going to release that information. And I imagine there are some other games like Fortnite and Roblox that would be in the top spots if they were releasing information. Total consumer spending for 2023 for hardware, content, and accessories was $57.2 billion, which was up 1% compared to 2022. So video games still, as a form of entertainment, probably the biggest and the thing people spend the most amount of money on. GameDeveloper.com has another advertisement, I imagine, as an article. Deep dive, player-centered narrative design in Slay the Princess. Yeah, this definitely feels like an advertisement. Of course, the idea of these kinds of articles on GameDeveloper.com kind of need to exist because they should be going into deep dive coverage of games and how games are designed, having the name GameDeveloper.com, and they really don't do that consistently enough. This game, Slay the Princess, I think is just a visual novel with branching storylines, which, yeah, it feels like it is a branching storyline with multiple endings visual novel, somewhat similar to 999 or maybe I wouldn't really call it a princess maker equivalent. Plenty of Japanese games love to have branching multiple endings, particularly visual novels. It's pretty common. I'd say at least half of all visual novels have branching different endings. And certainly I could go on to a rant here that this looks like this is a Western animated style and Western made visual novel that is getting coverage, when Western mainstream video game media bends over backwards to censor and not make any coverage about anything, any visual novel made from a Japanese creator, when Japanese clearly invented the concept and have dominated the concept of visual novels. A story about Slay the Princess and its player-centered narrative design should clearly be a story about something like and now I've forgotten the name of it. Well, take your pick. Take your pick of the top 10 Japanese visual novels. They will all have, they would all justifiably have this exact same story written. And if you wanted to talk about a newer visual novel that isn't so revered yet, there's plenty of new Japanese visual novels you could have made a story around this, like this around. This isn't video game related, but the attempting to be the third wheel in comic books company Distillery, as a publisher, is doing original art giveaways via a reader survey, which, yeah, you might get in on the bottom floor of having original art by names that could be very well known in the future, very popular. Notably, I would say the original art they're showing here is not something that they spend hours on, which this is, I think, a great example to point out of this is what an artist will do as an original concept art, or if they were paid extra to draw a picture and sign a blank comic book, which they sell these blank comic book where the front of the comic book is blank for an artist to draw. It's going to be done potentially with a Sharpie or a marker. It's not going to be done with super expensive pencils or paints or paintbrushes. And the artists have always taken about a month, if not longer than a month, to make one cover art image for comic books, and then the internal drawings and animations are often done a little bit quicker but at a lower quality too. But yeah, there's a easy mistake you can make as far as estimating how long it takes somebody to draw something, where it feels like comic book art could be done instantaneously, or you'll see some web comic people that are doing art on a weekly basis or on a daily basis. But usually when you see those kinds of web comic arts, it is done in a style that makes it very easy to animate things. When you're going for hyper realistic styles of drawing, that takes time. And the reality is, we should all realize and appreciate that the Sistine Chapel took like decades, I think, to paint, and most of the paintings, like the Mona Lisa, are things that took extremely long amounts of time to paint, on top of the fact that that was literally their job and the only thing they were doing. And most of those painters had assistants that go uncredited in history, so tracing and drawing the same painting over and over and over again until you get it right just increased the time it took, and having assistants to speed up the effort maybe helped it a little bit. But yeah, art takes time, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make while I'm putting out points that argue in different directions, not really making a coherent argument. And people really should realize that art takes time. If you're pooping out art at a very fast pace, you probably are not putting a lot of effort into it and should slow down. But yeah, Distillery is giving away original art things via reader survey. Also, as far as comic books, there's a bit of news, and it's an interesting story as far as what happens to programs when they are really abandoned. We don't have any real legal there really is no legality to it. Copyright is copyright, and unless you could literally prove that a person is dead and they have no inheritance at all, or no estate that would go to family members, and even at that, I feel like if somebody made a program and they died and they had no friends or family who could claim the copyright on the program, it probably still would just end up in the hands of the country or the city or the county that the person is in. It doesn't just become inherently public domain. The concept of abandonware, as far as I understand it, really has no legal basis at all. But maybe there is something in the copyright laws around it. So, having said all that, there is one notable piece of software called Comic Rack that effectively is abandonware. I think almost anyone would agree it's abandonware. It hasn't been updated in probably 10 years. The programmer, who was very responsive and ran his website and was very much interacting for a while, and then he just went silent. His website stayed up with a forum for a long time. Eventually the forums got taken over by spam bots and it got shut down, and I believe comicrack.com eventually as a website just went away completely. So it is generally assumed that this programmer got hit by a bus, for lack of a better explanation. Not specifically that he was hit by a bus, but he died in some way, and his friends and family didn't even know that this program existed. Now, in 99.9% of the time, an abandonware software that's old would just not really have that much value, and people really wouldn't care. Nobody cares about the first version of Word, which you probably could just get for through an archive website anyways. But Comic Rack in particular was very well programmed, very well received, very functional for sorting and organizing local copies of compressed zip files that would have comic book scans in them. There's never been any successful or well done attempt as far as running things like Comixology, which Amazon bought and then I think ruined with changes they made to their website. There's never been any other site directly from Marvel or DC to have some kind of way to easily have downloads of comic books and local copies of comic books. Amazon basically wants you to do comic books on the Kindle through the Amazon Kindle app, and there are a couple of other programs that might make sense, but some of them are going more for smaller collections, and or they're going for running servers, and probably going with the server options that they've been very slow to develop and improve on. The server options is the right thing. Now, if you were just talking books, Calibre would be the program to use, or as certainly as a book organizer, but Calibre is woefully inadequate when you're trying to organize and sort in the pedantic way that comic book fans want to organize and sort their comics. Plus, Comic Rack really was the only software that could handle the massive amount of comics people would like to get. That is perhaps part of the reason why Comic Rack isn't as popular as it really should be, in that the best way to use Comic Rack is almost certainly to try and download the entirety of DC and Marvel comics from the past. Have 50 to 100,000 comics in your library, which definitely makes more of an argument for a website that you would just subscribe to like Netflix and actually just pay Marvel and DC people to have control of that. But yeah, if you have 5 comics, Comic Rack may be very nice, but it's not really designed for that. You really don't have to sort that much. So anyways, it's been probably at least 5 years, maybe 7 or 8, maybe a lot longer than that, since it's been pretty obvious that Comic Rack was abandoned. And in the death of an app, to answer the question as far as what happens to a program when it's abandoned, there's still a active Reddit subreddit, the r/Comic Rack, I believe, and they have straight up decided, at least one person has straight up decided, to decompile the code and put it out on GitHub as a community edition, fully admitting that this is copyright infringement, and fully admitting that if the original creator would bother to contact anybody, if he is still alive, that he would take it down. But yeah, the demand, the public's demand, the public interest, as you would argue, is so high in this case that the protection of copyright and giving the original creator the right to not sell the product, to not release the product, is being overwhelmed by mob rule in favor of a community edition. So it'll be interesting to see if a content ID copyright claim comes down. Inherently, it feels like almost anybody, any troll, could put out a copyright claim against it and take it down anyways, even if the original creator didn't. But yeah, inherently, Comic Rack still needs to be rebuilt from scratch in a white box room instead of just taking the code. The functionality of the app and the look of the app should be recreated in a white box situation with all new code and all new integrations. Comic Rack ran on .NET infrastructure, which works very well for Windows PC, but is not portable to Linux at all. So something like reading comics on the Steam Deck, which is very interesting in the idea, falls apart very quickly if you try to use Comic Rack. There is a Android app, but you basically have to get the cracked version of the Android app to install and use it because it's not on the Play Store anymore. With the Community Edition, the Android app will wirelessly connect to your library on your computer, so you're not downloading 50,000 comics to an Android phone or a tablet. But I don't believe there was an iOS app ever, and it would be impossible to sideload it. The fact that you might need an app anyways for cell phones or tablets does make more of an argument towards having a web server instead. And there are other apps for cell phones and tablets that will play comic books, certainly, and integrate with the extra metadata that is put into the comics from Comic Rack, but none of them are particularly good. They're all very much built around the idea that you'll have 10 to 100 comics, a very reasonable amount in the minds of the creator and fairly unreasonable amount in the minds of a reader, particularly when you think Marvel DC comics are 16 pages. If DC is really releasing 52 issues of some comic every month, and you wanted to actually read all of them, there's your 52 out of 100 that most of the other apps are designed around working. They probably can handle more, but the interface and the sorting is the problem, because you uniquely in comics, and I'll get back to video game news here in a second, the unique thing in comics is that you have stacks of comics. You would have your Spider-Man stack, and in that Spider-Man stack of comics you would have the Amazing Spider-Man substack versus Superior Spider-Man substack versus the Adventures of Spider-Man, if that's one too. And inside each of those substacks, or even across some of those substacks, you might have a series or a sub-series or an arc. Comics in particular are designed to make you jump around and read certain books. So it's very possible that there would be an arc where you need to read Spider-Man 158 and then Punisher 187 and then I don't know, Batman 157, which that would be crossing over from Marvel to DC, but whatever. So making entire reading lists and arcs and labeling things correctly and numbering which issue in an arc should be read before the other thing, or all the kinds of pedantic metadata that you kind of need to properly ingest comics if you're big into comics. So suffice it to say, comics are held up by a small but very passionate group of fans, and Comic Rack is a very small but extremely passionate subset of that group of fans too. So yeah, they have gone and done something, at least one person has gone and done something that I have never seen tried before, as far as just drawing a line in the sand and saying it's enough. We've mourned the death and the missing of the creator, which everybody liked the creator. I think he was like in Ukraine many years ago, so I wouldn't be surprised if he straight up either got arrested by some kind of Eastern Bloc Russian people and thrown into some secret prison, or just disappeared, or just died randomly. I also wouldn't be surprised if there was just major legal threats thrown against the creator of Comic Rack himself, because the vast majority of people probably were using Comic Rack to just read stolen comics that they were BitTorrenting or whatever. So it arguably didn't have a lot of legitimate uses, and it didn't have a lot of ways to make him a lot of money, and it definitely felt like the creator was trying to get more people to give him money for his great program, and the audience there just didn't have the money or wasn't willing to spend the money, which that is the way I imagine a lot of projects can go. Is you can make something great, but you can also just have the wrong audience, and convincing people to part with their money is extremely difficult in almost every scenario. But yeah, I guess I'll keep you abridged and keep an eye out to see if the Comic Rack Community Edition stays around and makes significant improvements. At the moment, it has been kind of updated and improved a little bit, but there's a lot of catch up that certainly could be done as far as just improving and adding more features overall. A big part about Comic Rack 2 was that it was often using a plugin that would scrape Comic Vine, one of the Whiskey Media sister companies to Giant Bomb, and I don't know if the Comic Vine website is particularly in that great of state, since they've pretty much given up. They fired everybody there, and I think the website and forums still exist, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's fairly stagnant and gets only a few updates here and there. And that is in part of the problem, I think, with Comic Crack 2, is that to properly get the comics in there is you need to get the metadata in there, and manually adding metadata is going to be a nightmare, or manually sorting things is going to be a nightmare, which again makes a very much better argument for something like Comixology. Clearly Comixology, had they just made a better website, should be the successful thing. And every time you buy a comic book, you should be able to get some kind of credit to use Comixology, and you should be pushed towards a Comixology. It's a little kind of crazy that Disney owns Marvel and Disney Plus doesn't have any way to kind of press a button and get to a comic book reading function inside Disney Plus streaming apps. Moving on though, let's get back to video games in a second, I guess. YouTube Creators is retweeting people who are getting into the YouTube Partner Program. I will quickly point out that for every one person they are celebrating for getting in the YouTube Partner Program in 2024, there will be 1 million people plus that are not in the YouTube Partner Program feeling jealous and feeling irritated. Some of this makes some more sense as far as just make sure you've got your tax information right. That's valuable information to put out. But yeah. No changes really have been made to the YouTube Partner Program to make it easier. I still very much am at a situation where I would need a massive increase in watch time and about 250 more subscribers to be in the YouTube Partner Program. And once I was in the YouTube Partner Program, assuming they even let me in and then just reject my channel in general, it's real questionable as far as just how much actual money would come on a monthly basis with that small number of subscribers and views. It could literally just be $2 or $3 a month, if not less. Let's see, GameDeveloper.com says Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown makes neat use of mocap tech. I guess there is a general assumption that you can't use mocap technology on the 2D side-scrolling game. That would be not surprising if people assume that, but no, that's totally wrong. You totally can use mocap to make a 3D model that then gets flattened down into a 2.5D model. I saw a little bit of gameplay of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and yeah, it doesn't inherently feel like a Prince of Persia game. It feels like a Metroidvania game. It looks like it's probably fine for a Metroidvania game. But I so far haven't heard anybody really sing its praises. There is arguably a level of historical reason why you might want to use rotoscoping / mocapping. Well, rotoscoping is different than mocapping, but the original Prince of Persia was rotoscoped in the sense that somebody would do actions and then on film the actions would be recorded, and then the actual film of the film camera would be blown up into frames that were then traced using a digital tablet, a very rudimentary early digital tablet, to make the images and the sprite based pixel character in the original Prince of Persia. So they were capturing the motion by hand tracing over frame after frame after frame in a very laborious, repetitive process originally. Now motion capping is pretty automated, so it's much easier. Although I don't think it adds really much to the game, or any game, to follow a tradition and having mocapping just for mocapping's sake. It makes way more sense to have mocapping just to make the game look more realistic and smoother. Mocapping versus having animation and movements be animated by an artist or animated by scripting and artificial intelligence is a great example of something that has been around for decades, and AI has not gotten any better at it at all. Like, clearly the battle has been lost for decades to just have a real human walk like a real human and capture that, versus trying to program a program to walk like a real human and not pay a motion capture actor to be filmed. And nobody's even bothered to try that. So if we were going to see real AI start to be useful, I think the first thing we should see is AI generated motion, where you have human beings moving in smooth, fluid human ways, and being unrecognizable from the way a regular human would walk or move or jump. Moving on, GameDeveloper.com says the Pokemon-alike Palworld has sold 1 million copies in 8 hours, which, that's some massive success. Unfortunately, Palworld is always going to be compared to Pokemon because it clearly is ripping off Pokemon. So at some point, if it had a major amount of success, it does feel like they would want to get away from that comparison, but I don't see any way they could get away from that comparison other than becoming more popular than Pokemon, which I could see edgelord teenager kids these days going, well, I grew up loving Pokemon, but I really would love Pokemon with guns and some more violence in my games. But I don't know if the current generation of kids are really that violent at all. If anything, they often come off as more sweet and less aggressive than previous generations, and gun shy in general, just due to like all the mass shootings and things they've seen. So we may see a plateau at some point as far as the audience and the number of sales that Palworld can make. The bigger question certainly is there a real game here to play, or is this just more of a joke thing that is going to be funny for maybe 10 to 20 hours but won't go the distance like a Pokemon game for the 40 to 60 to 200 hours that most Pokemon games can be played at. Sega is not done making bad decisions yet, apparently, in that they are going to be creating more Web3 NFT type titles based on popular franchises. Remember, there was this first Web3 game where it was Sega characters in this weird mobile game, I think it was, in the future. I couldn't ever even really figure out what was going on with the game, and they fairly quickly canceled it because I don't think anybody could understand what was going on with the game. Instead of NFTs, they're saying blockchain. They're working with a blockchain company, but I think in their case they probably are searching for ways to use blockchain and searching for ways to have NFTs and cryptocurrency. I wouldn't be surprised if this is just a case that Sega invested in this Finch Chia company and they're propping them up for their own internal, like, insider trading reasons. Which, let's not forget that I believe at least 3 managers at Sega were arrested for insider trading around Sega products, the creator of Balan Wonderworld being the notable one there. And I believe he was found guilty on that, or he pleaded guilty on it, which is basically the same in Japan. We apparently just have a couple things that didn't want to load, so we'll skip forward. This is an interesting argument. I don't know if I can fully agree with it from GameDeveloper.com. It says, if Hollywood adapts more games, developers deserve a cut. The 2024 State of the Industry report indicates 1/4 of AAA developers are seeing their games adapted for film and television. At a certain point, it does create a weird situation where you probably do deserve some kind of residuals for being even a low-level programmer on making a video game if that video game then gets adapted to a secondary medium. Of course, that then would mean that nothing would ever get adapted to a secondary medium, which is probably more the better anyways, because I doubt a ton of video game movies would be good or successful anyways, although we're seeing better success from video game adaptations this year than we have ever before in history, or last year. But yeah, the question is, where do you draw the line, and who do you really consider inputting creative effort? Because if this was to really happen, almost certainly it would just be the licensee company that would be getting a cut, and they're already getting a cut. The argument would have to come down to more of a European style of moral rights around the creation, and even at that, the original creation of a video game would then have to be attributed to almost every single person. Every programmer, every game tester would have to own some tiny fraction of the creation of a product before they would have some kind of argument that they deserve some kind of residuals. And if they did get into residuals with Hollywood, Hollywood would just do its crazy Hollywood math. And notably in Hollywood, the actors, the grips, the editors tend not to really be credited as being part of the creative process. It's really only the producers, the directors, the writers that are getting that credit. So, yeah, I mean, these kinds of collaborative efforts. Again, I would say this is an example of capitalism rearing a weird question in what could be just an easier product. If it was just a case that people had their needs met, and then they would work on a Hollywood adaptation of a video game out of pure passion that they wanted to create some art, then they wouldn't have to make arguments that they deserve residuals or deserve a cut from some proceeds of the art. Theoretically, if everybody had their needs met with some kind of UBI, then you would have people just making movies and then just putting them out for free. People, the end consumer of a movie, the end user of a consumer, would just be able to watch the movie and be entertained, which keeps people happy, which is good for the government and the general economy. And then everybody who worked on the movie would have done it just for a sense of satisfaction and a sense of creating art, and they can claim they created it and take the verbal credit without trying to have to get some financial credit. There don't have to really be as many arguments about who did what or who deserves more credit than somebody else, because there's no financial aspect tied to it in a potential future situation. This is the Star Trek solution, where people were working in Starfleet not because they were getting a pension or money or anything like that. They were doing it for their own pride and prestige, and the better you worked and the more you worked in Starfleet, the more prestige you got. And it was always an interesting verbal argument that they would make in like Star Trek and the Next Generation when they talked about that, but it also wasn't ever really explained how that actually worked. And definitely flew over the heads of the species like the Ferengi, who are all about making profit and money. This is the kind of arguments that would happen behind closed doors in between unions, effectively, if there were unions in the video game world. So if, as we see potentially the video game industry become more unionized, we will start to see compromises made and arguments made as far as who gets credit and who deserves residuals in general. We've seen examples of these kind of arguments already happen as far as the original writer of the Witcher book series wanting more money for the success of the Witcher video games, and on a side job also leasing out the Witcher book general concept for the Netflix series. Video Games Chronicle says the potentially harmful Tekken 8 accessibility options are being updated. Players and experts have raised safety concerns about the colorblind filters. It definitely feels like, to me, what needs to happen is that by default, consoles and PCs should have a color palette lookup table app that you could just take your .lut files, which these exist already, and with that, people with certain color blinds would say anything between the range of a deep red to a light red needs to instead be a bright green to a deep green, and you could potentially scale that. But yeah, you would have those kinds of custom lookup table files. You'd probably have an application that helps you build your own lookup table files for each person's individual colorblind needs, and then the monitors and the visual output of consoles and PCs should just apply that universally without games being involved really at all, or having their own custom colorblind features, because they're not consistent at the least. Often they're not good, but they're not consistent. When there's just a better solution to move this up to a higher level of the operating system. And in that, you should be able to also flip a switch for when you're taking screenshots or recording video as to whether or not you want that video to be recorded with the lookup table colors changing things for color blindness, and by default it should just be disabled. But I could see people like Jeff Gerstmann, who has color blindness, wanting to every now and then record with the colorblind features applied so he can show other people what it looks like to him. But in the vast majority of times, Jeff Gerstmann probably wants his screenshots and recordings to not have that lookup table be applied. So you would want it very low in the chain, so it would happen after you did screenshots, after you did recordings. But that's really all I think they should do too, is have a setup app that Microsoft or Sony would make to help create the lookup tables, and maybe have some default suggestions for different types of, it seems like there's about 9 different common types of color blindness it could suggest. There's a website that suggests certain color palettes to use, but most people don't. I don't even remember the website, and it really probably is just one person's opinion as far as different colors to use. But there's been literally no progress on this problem for decades. Nobody's really tried to fix it in the digital factor in which it really could be fixed. And certainly if Microsoft made an app like that, they could apply it to Windows, and people in Photoshop and other industries would benefit from that quite a bit. Noticeably, no effort has been made, as far as I know, to make Word or Bing more colorblind accessible. Really is only video games that is even ambitious enough to try. And in this case, they were so ambitious that It seems like they made some mistakes there, some potentially hurtful mistakes, unhealthy mistakes. And then Sony, this is from Video Games Chronicle, is doing what they basically needed to do, otherwise they were going to have a major controversy yet again. And then they've already had this happen a couple times before, in which they've had people pre-order remastered versions of the game at full price, and then they have announced that actually there's a $10 upgrade fee that would be cheaper, or there's an upgrade path that is $10 cheaper. So Sony is doing the right thing here by refunding Last of Us 2 PS4 owners who bought the PS5 version at full price. Owners of the original game can just upgrade to the remastered version for $10 instead of paying the full $60 for the new remastered version. But yeah, that's a step in the right direction. We shouldn't applaud too hard, of course, around basic customer service and treating the customer right, which is really all I would say they're doing here. They're not going out of their way to do something nice and special. They're avoiding controversy that they've already seen. Okay, so very quickly here, I really don't have a lot of time today. We will go through the games of Wednesday and see if there's some more I can curate away. Although I can tell you immediately here, I'm not feeling super interested in covering these games. See, this is the same publisher and developer putting out 2 visual novels in the same day, which perhaps is a mistake. And then I guess I kind of have to click on the tabs and look. Here we have a prologue for a game that somewhat catches my eye with the feels like it's a survivor game of some sort, but it's really not. The Artifact Seeker game, maybe more of a Diablo collectathon game. But then noticeably here too, you're spinning a lot of screenshots showing off the characters, not really showing much of the game, at least for the prologue. But the prologue is doing fairly well, so people are liking it. But I won't put the prologue on the wish list, and I won't put the prologue in the way of making a YouTube short, because I already make too many YouTube shorts to begin with. Here we have what looks like a non-English Czech game that is fairly simplistic, but this may very well be the only Czech language game I've ever seen on Steam. It looks like it's a Frogger clone in that you potentially are trying to cross without being eaten by the sharks, or maybe you're moving the boats to avoid being eaten by the sharks. Let's see, Clem here. Looks like a point and click adventure. This game, Toy Trains, is VR, so probably would say no, but I guess I'll give it a chance. VR has changed now. It's no longer just a red warning sign. Atlas Wept, I think I can say no to. Cat Warrior, I'll give a chance. Then we have what looks like a mobile phone collection of mini games, so I'm going to say no to that. Mecha Party, I'll give a chance to. Yuna and the Haunted Hot Springs has now come out officially. Let's see if the reviews are very high. No, it's still pretty low. It went from 1 review to 7 user reviews. I wouldn't be surprised if this is somewhat censored and thus people are not loving it. I guess I should have clicked the translate button here so I could read what they're saying. The operation buttons are not user friendly. Controls are not officially supported. I was able to operate it with an Xbox controllers, but the instructions are similar to those of a keyboard, making it very difficult to understand. So there's some control problems, otherwise people seem to like it fairly well. So it may be a case that this mini game here may be actually the main gameplay mechanic, and there's some problems here. And this is an interesting gameplay mechanic in general, in that you're knocking away ghosts, I guess, away from a central tower and playing kind of a tower defense game with an anime girl in a steamy towel. It definitely doesn't seem like that's the main thing you're doing, or more of it seems like it's just a dungeon crawler. But yeah, not a lot of Western people playing it yet, or reviewing it yet at least. No case should remain unsolved is a little bit iffy. It's a little too black and white in the color palette for my taste, but I'll give it a chance. Then some of these games like Distant Sun could easily just be an asset flip first person shooter, but there might be something to it. Here we've got what looks like a Western visual novel. Perhaps there is some question as far as, should I make a YouTube short around the game if I don't really have anything to say around it? And that's an interesting question, but I think that would probably be too much of a level of curating and censoring for just no good reason. Like, particularly when I'm already tired and I am jumping through these tabs very quickly. That may be more of a symptom, because there are a lot of games here that visually catch my attention, but I would just be repeating myself if I said, well, that looks interesting, or that looks interesting. Here we have a game called All Quiet in the Trenches, which is basically the same as War Hospital in the general thought. It's not actually a hospital, but in contrast, you have 90% positivity out of 85. So clearly you can make a game around this theme and make it work. War Hospital just really didn't make it work. See, that's pretty much it too. So while we have seen an increase in the number of games ever since the new year started, the growth in increase doesn't feel like it has gone significantly higher. And for the first time, not only in 2024, but since I've started to really try and keep an eye on the Steam charts as far as concurrent players in the last 24 hours, we see an actual game that I immediately recognize as being a new game that was not in the top 15, jumping to the top 4 spot in the Game Pal world, which this may just be something that is a hugely successful game. I mean, clearly any decently well-made Pokemon clone would have sold very well And this will certainly piss off Nintendo in the fact that they failed to port any of their games to PC, and maybe it will motivate Nintendo to quickly port all of their games to PC before people rip them off completely. But yeah, number 4 spot, noting that the numbers of players as far as the top 3 spots are typically extremely high anyways. Number 4 spot will knock down other things. So in this case, Warframe and War Thunder and Football Manager 2024 have been knocked downward below the top 15. Overall, the numbers still feel very strong as far as the overall player base in the top 15 games. But the fact that this is the first time I've seen something like this either indicates that the top list is far too consistent to be really that informative to talk about on a weekly basis, or that my macro and my chart just needs to delve far deeper into the list to see the changes. That it's probably way more helpful to perhaps follow the top 50 versus the top 15. And we will see very quickly here when I go to my chart if we see Palworld jump up or if my chart just screws up completely. Let's see, where would Palworld be? It should be here. Here it is. So jump up would have been wrong, actually, come to think of it, because this would be the first week with any data point as far as information. So we have this blue dot, and this is where information could be very helpful, is when you do see a dot. But in these cases where you see a dot, that's just because the macro broke. These should be connected lines in most of these cases. And in the case of like the finals playtest getting replaced by the finals, that there's something to be said about connecting those two dots too. So yeah, Palworld starts with its initial data point, and next time we stream on Monday, we'll see if it goes up or if it goes down or if it just disappears completely. I would like to see more dots and more games get in the top 10 for a week and be super popular for a couple of weeks and then go away for making room for new games, but that's not typically how this works, and just the law of averages kind of implies it wouldn't work that way. Baldur's Gate 3 still spiking up and then going down. Same is true for Naraka Blade Point. Apex Legends going down. There's no real chart here, and I'm noticing that the numbers now are getting far too squashed anyways, and it's just not readable anymore. And so I need to mess with the chart and limit it. There's still data points being added all the way back to when I started in September of 2023, but by showing each number, that's a problem. I need to just turn off all these labels, and then that would clean up the visuals quite a bit. And yeah, that's something that the chart needs to be full of data before you really recognize that. But yeah, you don't need the numbers, because as soon as you hover over a dot, it tells you the number anyways. Well, the good news there, I guess, is that the chart at least got the information correct, or somewhat correct, but the bad news is it is very much gotten squished and turned into a mess, and trends are still not really being depicted as being very helpful, because it is mostly just the top 5 to 15 games going up and down in popularity. There's an indication here that video gamers are just not as fad based as you might think they are, and that they don't just buy the newest games and play them and then move on to the next game. Palworld getting full front page early access. I guess it's still in early access ads on Steam, which again, I'm not sure if a full page takeover is something that Steam decides to do or if it's something that Steam gets paid to do, or algorithmically they decided to do it. I would say in this case Steam probably got paid to do it, because you just wouldn't have this artwork ready if it was just an algorithm thing where they recognized that a bunch of people were playing Palworld and buying Palworld. Otherwise, there is really nothing happening here on Steam. Although this Petite Game Collection Volume 1 seems a little weird for being a new and trending game. Let's go through the Video Games Chronicle articles quickly here. Palworld's Xbox servers are limited to 2 to 4 players, while Steam gets up to 32 players. The quote here is, "We'd like to have dedicated servers on Xbox, but it's unfortunately not up to us," says Pocket Bear. This feels like a problem we have not heard other people claim to have. So I don't know if there is perhaps a larger limitation on the number of players through the servers through Xbox. Inherently, almost nobody plays even with 4 players on an Xbox on games, and I don't think any of the other games on Xbox really support more than 4 players anyway, so it may very well just be an institutionalized hard limit to say we only support 4 players because you can only really control and connect 4 wireless connectors to an Xbox. And on the TV, having more than 4 players is very questionable anyways. But yeah, I guess that's just more argument to play on PC, which it'll be interesting to see if we ever get any numbers, the difference between people who bought Palworld on PC versus people who bought Palworld on Xbox. I'm not sure Palworld is on the PlayStation, and almost certainly it won't be on the Switch. We already talked about this story. Let's see. Raven has apologized for a botched Warzone update and teases the return of fan favorite features, which inherently, I guess that is a good deceptive way to apologize about something. In that you could make some nebulous promises, so most people will just hear the promises and forget about the negatives. We talked about Sony refunding Last of Us 2 owners. A Capcom 40th anniversary range is coming to a costume t-shirt maker called Uniqlo, which, yeah, I imagine it'll be fairly expensive t-shirts. It doesn't look particularly amazing as far as the quality of the t-shirts or the prints on the t-shirt, by the looks of it. And frankly, I would struggle to be certain as far as what game this is even from. This is Street Fighter, it looks like, or just Capcom characters in general, where this, I have no clue. This is Street Fighter, or no, this isn't actually Street Fighter, this is I want to say Fatal Fury, but I don't think that's what it really is. Streets of Rage, maybe? And even zoomed in, I can't even make out what that is. And I can't click on this picture to see it anyways. Let's see if I click on the pic Twitter, if that does anything for me. Yeah, Twitter apparently is starting to go towards paying some people to make video slash podcast, which is interesting if that succeeds. But I mean, this is Devil May Cry, I can now tell. But even in their screenshots here, you're seeing some real problems as far as just trying to zoom in and see a picture. And so, while I've been able to identify one more t-shirt, this is obviously Mega Man, but with some weird visual effects on it, anti-aliasing effects. This would be Street Fighter 2. This is Resident Evil remakes. Yeah, I still can't figure out the name of this game, although I do recognize it. I can't see this tiny screen at all, and I can't place this one. Personally, I would like to see, and the picture is actually better and larger here in this case than clicking on it. I would like to see Twitter succeed in being a competitor to YouTube, at least a little bit, to push YouTube to actually be competitive. But the best case scenario, and this is only a slight modification of what I have said when Elon Musk first took over Twitter, is that Elon Musk may implement some changes, and then the next person in charge might take those changes and make them successful. I think in the past I argued Elon Musk might be the burning fire, and then somebody else would have to be the cleansing rain as far as just making changes. I had a slight twinge to make a couple of videos that would not be YouTube related and would be very silly, but somebody definitely needs to make a retrospective of just like the Twit This Week in Technology channel and Leo Laporte being in charge of that effectively, and just how he has utterly ruined his own collection of podcasts by injecting himself as being the celebrity, by being slow to change, just being old in general. It's kind of ageist to say, but yeah, there's just a long list of old style radio mentality ways of in which he's run his podcast network to its own detriment. But in all fairness, also, he has kept the Twit network going, where, say, G4 failed completely, and CNET has failed completely. At this point, nobody's going to CNET anymore. CNET doesn't have a figurehead to really blame, but undoubtedly, whoever's been in charge of CNET has made more mistakes than Leo Laporte has. But yeah, the main thing is Leo Laporte and the Twit network very much feels like they wanted to just continue doing what they wanted to do instead of growing. And the old adage, grow or die, it has slowly sunk in on them, and eventually we are just going to have a Twitter, maybe not called Twitter anymore, that is doing videos when the Twit network was stopping the old Twitter in part from making videos. I'm kind of rambling here. Moving on, the Elder Scrolls Online's next expansion, Gold Road, launches in June, which I imagine for Elder Scrolls Online people, that's somewhat exciting. I don't know how many people are still playing Elder Scrolls Online, but probably a decent amount. If I was a super fan of Skyrim, obviously you have to play online. That's your only real option. We talked about this. Let's see. Well, here's a absolute terrible article from Video Games Chronicle. Let me just turn off all the ad blocking and see if something went wrong here. Nope. Yeah, something did go wrong with my ad blocker here. They have a YouTube video link here that clearly should be a screenshot. And then there is text that is being blocked by my ad blocker. That being said, even the text doesn't really say too much. Still really don't know anything about Avowed. We already talked about Indiana Jones, and definitely more hyped on Indiana Jones than Avowed or Senua's Saga. The release date is going to be May 21st for Hellblade 2. And then some of these stories might be old as far as the update here for the patch on Steam is now live in Steam Beta, introducing over 100 fixes and improvements. Nobody really talking about that. GTA 5's Rockstar editor is shutting down. We talked about it. All clips and projects will also be deleted, which, yeah, that's not a good way to support your fan base, to say the least. And I think pretty much all of these are stories from previous, the previous stream. I guess at this point I'm just giving up on trying to get the Epic free games if I'm going to not be able to log in because of the CAPTCHA over and over again. Here's some stories though I don't recognize. A PopCap apparently has soft-launched Plants vs. Zombies 3. It'll be playable in selected countries ahead of its worldwide release this year. It'll be interesting to see what it is, because Plants vs. Zombies 2 took it in a weird direction and wasn't great. This definitely feels much more in line with Plants vs. Zombies 1. Although, questionably, I don't know if you can add that much to the Plants vs. Zombies 1 game to change things. You need to inherently add more plants and add more challenges. It doesn't seem like they've added any plants here. And they've got some kind of lawn decoration minigame element. And they've clearly moved it ahead in time and made the visuals better. I'm seeing maybe 3 different currencies, so hopefully there's not a bunch of in-app purchases and nonsense like that. Overall, this looks good though. That definitely doesn't look terrible. It probably will be a while though before it comes out to any kind of consoles or PC. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're releasing this because A, they don't have anything better to release or any other ideas, but also because they are desperate to try and release yet another Plants vs. Zombies Modern Warfare or Garden Warfare game to try and have a kid-friendly version of Modern Warfare playable for kids. But I don't think those games have succeeded very well either. Then we already talked about Rocksteady's co-founders establishing a new studio. And then Rock Band 4's weekly DLC support is ending after 8 years. If you're a fan of the rhythm game category, Fortnite Festival is the place to be. Apparently is the sub-headline statement. Modern Warfare 3 and Warzone Season 1 Reloaded patch notes were released as the update goes live. The update here being new Warzone features pulled after the update launches with a number of performance issues. And then I talked about the Larian boss saying their game Baldur's Gate 3 won't come to subscription services. And then that brings us to the Gematsu articles. A parry-based hand-drawn Metroidvania game called Deviator has been announced for PC, coming out on February 1st. Okay. I could certainly be a little concerned about a parry-based game, because usually in parry-based games you are unable to do any damage whatsoever unless you actively succeed in parrying. Which can be incredibly frustrating, particularly for players who don't have very good timing skills or just like to button mash. Ideally, in a parry-based game, you would do some amount of damage by button mashing, but it would be way faster if you actually succeeded in parrying. Let's see, Palworld Early Access sales topping 1 million in only 8 hours. The Needy Streamer Overload spin-off minigame called Collection Petite Game Collection Volume 1 is now available for PC. Now I understand why that game was in the new and trending section of Steam, is that it's based off of another game that was somewhat popular. It definitely seems like there is some implied romance that might be happening here. Genshin Impact version 4.4 update launches January 31st. I assume Genshin Impact still doing pretty well. These kinds of games that have major amounts of success early tend to just go on forever until they finally pull the plug once the player base has slowly whittled away to being less profitable, or the creators of a game like Genshin Impact decide to launch a new game and want to move all of their player base to that new game. I see on the chat we have Charles saying hello, and then he says I have to go, but I wish you a good day. Thank you, Charles. Sorry if I didn't see your message earlier. A game called AI Limit launches in 2024 for the PS5 and PC. Let's see if we can get some more screenshots. Well, yes, it definitely looks like very interesting visuals for an action RPG rogue Souls-like, according to the tags. But I wouldn't say that they particularly have too much to show yet. And there is a danger when you only have a few screenshots and you're not seeing any like actual interface or heads-up displays. Let's see. Kazutaka Kodaka teases Limit X Despair title announcement in a not too distant future, which this I guess is supposed to be a joint project between Kotaro Uchikoshi, which, yeah, this is probably teaser art and not fully in line with what the game actually looks like. And I don't even really know what they're referencing with Limit and Despair. The Zero Escape series AI to summon their files. Yeah. So yeah, it's a tease to say the least, and a tease I'd have to even do more research to remember the names of the games. Like there's one visual novel where kids are all trapped and they're killing off each other. And I believe that's the Despair series they're referencing. As far as the limit part of that, I don't even know what they're really talking about there. And it seems like in this teaser art they've potentially combined attributes of different characters from those two series to create a weird overlapping of one amalgamation of a character. Moving on, Made of the Dead launches February 15th for the Switch and this spring for the PC, which is a interesting twist from what you usually see, which is games releasing first on PC. Although when I do look at the screenshot, it does feel like the actual gameplay here is fairly rudimentary, and this does come off as one of those Nintendo eShop low effort games. That being said, they've got some lewd imagery here. You have a maid that's been bitten, but they make sure that the skirt is up and the thighs are showing and the cleavage is showing too. I wouldn't put a lot of faith in this being a really high quality game, although in all fairness, Onichambara is also not a really high quality game, and yet it managed to gain an audience. But I would say, I imagine the actual gameplay mechanic and how much time you have to spend in this gameplay mechanic is not worth it. It definitely seems like the game is willing to do some clothing destruction and have a decent amount of lewdness for a Switch game, but I doubt it really is going to go that far and have actual nudity in the Switch game. Maybe the PC version will. Street Fighter 6 DLC character Ed launches in February. We already talked about the Elder Scrolls Gold Road expansion coming June 3rd for PC and June 18th for PS4 and 5 and Xbox One and Series. I think I'd like to see by the end of this year them drop PS4 and Xbox One support completely, or for the most part. Do we have a Steam listing for Indiana Jones? Yes, we do. I like this younger faced Indiana Jones alright, but it does seem a little off-putting. It just doesn't feel like there's enough stubble and enough wrinkles in the face. Feels like they've smoothed over the visuals. There is, I guess, a question as far as how is this game really going to play, because at a certain level this almost feels like it's a first-person VR game. Like it is a first-person game, which is weird. I almost certainly want to go to a third-person mode. You're just whipping people and taking pictures in this case. I don't know what we're really hoping for here either. It may just be a case that they're bending over backwards as a developer as Machine Games, the makers of the Wolfenstein game, to not turn it into a Wolfenstein game where you're first person shooting a gun. So instead that you're first person whipping and first person shooting of a camera. But I could see a scenario certainly where this game is incredibly linear. You get it at the beginning of a level, you walk down a very narrow pathway, and then you exit a level, and that there isn't really any adventure happening or anything that would feel like an adventure, or that there aren't multiple paths, or there aren't really a lot of puzzles. I could definitely see it not being anywhere close to being open world, which I think I would prefer more of an open world feel, since the point and click adventure games of other Indiana Jones had decent open world feels to them also. But yeah, I'd like to see some puzzle solving gameplay footage. How long is this gameplay reveal? Like 3 minutes? Right. It does just have this weird first person feel to all of it, or you may just be watching other people interact with other people, or you may be just yeah, I find that first person really off-putting here. It gets you more in the action, certainly, but I kind of question if the actual gameplay that they're showing here isn't just this small section here where you're swinging and whipping and getting these combat arena sections done. And that definitely feels like that could be very linear in those sections. So it does feel like there might be a case where you have a lot of cutscenes you're seeing, particularly in the third, when you see India in the third person. It definitely feels like a tough sell. And they are kind of undercutting, certainly, the idea of having Indiana Jones's likeness or Harrison Ford's likeness if you are in first person the whole time. Yeah, it definitely wasn't what I was expecting. Moving on, Komatsu has Aura Histories Untold launching this fall. Let's see if we've got that on the fall list. Yes, we do. Do we have a specific date in fall? No. And then Visions of Mana launches this summer. We definitely are getting announcements for games that are decently far in the future. Although summer's not that far in the future. I guess if we got things announcing at the end of 2024 or winter of 2024, that would be a little premature. Senua Saga launching May 21st. Let's make sure we'll make a YouTube short around that. Honestly, this is more to the level of the quality I'd like to see Indiana Jones at. This is hyper realistic visuals, focusing on the face of the main protagonist quite a bit in every screenshot. Avowed launching in fall. This is a very weird looking image for Avowed, but it definitely isn't helping me further understand what Avowed is supposed to be. It definitely comes off like it's supposed to be some kind of fantasy Skyrim type world, which, in fairness, if it is a Skyrim type game, I hope it's successful. It would be fairly great to play something like Skyrim that is more modern and isn't made by Bethesda. This video is private, noticeably, as far as the behind the scenes, so that's a problem. A game called Revile launches March 6th, which I assume this is some kind of horror game. Does seem like you go to several different locations. First person psycho thriller game that focuses on story puzzles and exploration. Okay. I'm a little intrigued by that. Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters for Xbox One and Series launches April 16th. It's already out for Steam. And despite some censorship, I believe, in this game, it is overall very well received as part of the Neptunia series, although there is still very much this weirdness where a lot of these Neptunia games are just remakes of previous Neptunia games or reboots into different universes. So you have to do quite a lot of research to know whether Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters is a good game to start playing the series on, or if it's actually a successor, or if it's a skippable game in general. A Sea of Stars Physical Edition launches May 10th, according to Gamatsu. Unicorn Overlord details more characters, classes, leaders, and promotions on Gamatsu, which looks like a fantasy game. I still haven't really figured out what you would call this style. It is almost anime Tolkien-esque, anime Lord of the Rings. There's some deeper browns, darker fantasy. I'd hate to just describe something as a dark fantasy because the color palette is darker than what you typically see in an anime color palette, but that would be a poor choice of words. The natural tone fantasy. Maybe just call it nature fantasy. But yeah, that might be the best shorthand description of this art style, where you have these natural tone browns on fantasy characters. And it definitely just seems like it's a color palette and an art style that is becoming more and more used, particularly from Final Fantasy style games and Square Enix style spin-off games. Let's see, moving on. Memories Off 1 to 7 is coming to Steam in Japanese, Traditional Chinese, and Simplified Chinese, which is quite the list of games. But it is also very much an example of a Japanese visual novels really coming to the PC gamers, the growing audience of PC gamers in Japan, and not really bothering to translate. Which overall, this is still a good thing, because that does tell you that there are more PC gamers showing up in Japan, which means overall there will be more of a chance of games getting translated. And there might be fan patches of these games, so owning these games on Steam and then finding a mod that would put in English may still be easier. But clearly this is a long-running series of visual novels. Long-running being a relative term. Frankly, you could put out a new visual novel every 6 months and have 7 of them. But you wouldn't do that unless it was at least somewhat successful. And a fairly consistent art style as the games evolve. So yeah, this is definitely a good thing to see as far as seeing more Japanese games released on Steam versus being released on Japanese exclusive web stores. And things like this being things like this happening, more games being on Steam, may increasingly push even the likes of Sony and Nintendo to consider pushing more of their games on Steam, and potentially not just being console exclusive developers. Anyways, I'm going long today, I need to hurry up. A tactical mech shooter called Armor Attack has been announced for consoles, PC, iOS, and Android. So a long list there. Not anything super amazing in those screenshots though. Although tank games aren't really my style. A game called Cataclysmo launches in Q2 of 2024. Don't believe we have a Steam link for that. Tekken 8 launch trailer is available on Gamatsu if you want to check that out. The Alone in the Dark Welcome to Dorcido trailer is available. I assume that's how you pronounce that. The Famitsu sales from the 8th to the 14th have been updated. So, let's see, what do we have new? Football Manager 2024 in the 16th spot. Nintendo Switch games in the first 28 spots, with Football Manager 2024 taking the 29th spot for the PS5, and then back to Nintendo Switch. Nintendo would be the last one, obviously, to switch over to making PC releases, because Nintendo is very much in Japan consistently selling Switch titles and hardware. And noticeably, things from Sega like Puyo Puyo Tetris Special Price would not pay any license to Nintendo at all if they were to release on Steam. Only first party Nintendo products, Nintendo published products, would be making any money by publishing on Steam. So, yep, it would be a big switch for them to go to PC releasing also. Undoubtedly, the Steam Deck is also increasing the number of visual novels coming to Steam. I wouldn't be surprised if the Steam Deck is a particularly good device to play visual novels on the train as you're commuting, versus cell phones or tablets, which there really aren't any cell phones or tablets that can easily emulate or play PC games like visual novels. And inherently, obviously, visual novels are still very popular. And then the Steam OLED version is still selling quite well, although the PS5 is doing pretty good too. And Xbox Series X is still doing very small numbers. This is the old information before it was updated. A game called Library of Ruina is coming to the PS4 and Switch on April 25th in Japan and Asia, and then coming to spring worldwide. It's currently already available for Xbox and PC, which this trend continues to happen quite a bit, where games are first establishing themselves on the PC or Xbox, and then once they are established, coming out a couple of years later as ports for PS4 and Switch, although oddly not PS5 in this case. Wuthering Waves second closed beta registration is now available if you want to try and log into that beta. Let's see. Toshimichi Mori's studio Flare reveals the first key visual and concept artworks. We finally have projects and scenarios being made. So you have a bunny girl looking across a city with a dome behind it, or dome over it. Interesting, it's kind of a rounded dome here, and then when they zoom out it's more of a pyramid. Of course, these are just kind of key art concepts and visuals, so it's still quite a way from them having anything to actually show or say. It's far too early to be talking about their project, obviously, but obviously the names of certain directors, developers, holds enough weight that people are interested. A game called Love and Deep Space is now available for smartphones. It's a 3D simulation, dating simulation game for iOS and Android, which we really haven't seen a massive amount of press releases for mobile games on Gematsu. So we may be at the beginning of a new trend where mobile releases are contacting Gematsu and then they're making articles about it, or there are just going to be more efforts in making mobile games and releasing them. I imagine the lack of good advertising of mobile games is a reflection of the poor quality of most mobile games. We definitely see a lot of ads inside one mobile game advertising another mobile game, but the ads tend to be extremely cheap, as extremely poor quality. The games they're advertising tend to be extremely cheap and extremely poor quality. Cheap in quality, often not cheap in expense. So maybe we're seeing a slight improvement in quality overall. A Perry and Buddy action game called Perry Nightmare launches March 1st for PC. It's an interesting art style to just have a screw going through the chest of some monster-like creature with a foaming mouth in their hand. Of course, that one visual also isn't really doing much to explain what's going on. To me, it looks like it's a survivor's game, which, okay, that's what I'll assume it is, and then I'll put it on the follow list and move on. A game called Immortal Life is now available for PC. The console versions are due out at a later date. This is a farming, Chinese influenced farming game, farming sim, which I'll make a YouTube short on it, but I'm not gonna put it on the follow list because I don't like farming sims in general, and so a Chinese, Imperial Chinese version of that doesn't really change the description much. Now, I will say, looking at the screenshot, I do like the wide variety of characters on this concept art, or this title thumbnail, because very often it is kind of a one boring looking Chinese guy, maybe two or three boring looking Chinese guys, or you'll get two boring looking Chinese guys and then one somewhat boring looking Chinese girl. So being able to see 8 characters on the screen here, with one being clipped here, is a little bit better, a little bit more interesting. Persona 3's Reload Day 1 DLC has been announced. Costumes, personas, and background music are going to be available. So it seems like they are going to try and get a lot of money out of the fandom, which probably will succeed fairly well. Although I'm not sure if these costumes really matter that much, or if the music background player really matters that much for such an old game like Persona 3, where you could probably see all these costumes or listen to the music at least already. Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince shipments and digital sales have topped 1 million. Noticeably though, this game launched, it looks like, exclusively for the Switch on December 1st, so it has taken about a month and a half to reach 1 million, which is not really as good of a number as you would like to see. Some of that, I imagine, is the imbalance between just Dragon Quest fandom in Japan versus Dragon Quest fandom elsewhere in the world, and some of it is probably there being too much Dragon Quest games and oversaturation in the Dragon Quest releases. A Until Dawn movie is in development. We had talked about this before. And then this free puzzle adventure game Test for PC is available. I didn't realize it was free. So instead of having that on the follow list, let's just add it to the Steam library. And then we can take it off the follow list. Which I already have a tab open to make a YouTube short around that. Let's see. Escape the time loop as an overworked office employee. Interesting. Doesn't seem like this ties into anything else, and I'm not sure that this Mojinkin studio has released anything else yet. Space for Unbound, apparently, is what they released before. And a point and click called When the Past Was Around. But that may also be the publisher, not the developer. Bandle Tale, a League of Legends Stories, is coming February 21st. I think I put this on the fall list already. Yes, I did. So then that's going to bring us to the GameDeveloper.com. Now, noticeably, by spending the extra energy to reprogram my macro, it has worked today. It has opened the one link, hopefully correctly, at the top of this pyramid, then the 2 links below the top, and then the 3 links below. Then it just starts to go down this whole list until it finds one that it hasn't covered before. Now, problem with this, of course, is that its records are missing some information because I've been manually opening links for the past couple of weeks. So I imagine we've already talked about all the GameDeveloper.com stories, and we will just be closing a bunch of tabs really quickly on old stories. We can see one here. Square Enix wants to make fewer, better games. Is that the first story? Yes, it is. Which, yeah, I had already heard this and talked about it, but here we have an article in front of it. It is a smart move, certainly, to at least say that out loud. The more difficult thing is to actually stick to it. Fewer, better games, though, in a lot of ways feels like just making a Final Fantasy game and maybe one side game like Foam Stars. And inherently, I wouldn't be surprised if they make one Final Fantasy game and pretend like they put all their attention and focus on that one Final Fantasy game, and then immediately said they were disappointed by the sales of the next Final Fantasy game and decided to change the way they make games once again. There needs to be a real commitment and real actual skill in managing at Square Enix for this to work, and I'm not sure they actually have the skill in managing or commitment to stick to what they're saying. But we should just take them on face value of what they're saying and hope it is true. Although, for a lot of Westerners, while they may want to play Final Fantasy VII Remake, they probably aren't that deeply involved in the Final Fantasy games, so a really great Final Fantasy game still may not sell well enough just because nobody's willing to give it the amount of attention that Square Enix would want. There is also a major danger that making fewer, better games in the minds of Square Enix is to make a Final Fantasy game that is just 300 hours instead of 200 hours of gameplay, and that there is just longer grinds, which most people don't really want that, I imagine, either. We talked about Pal World. The 2K Games has made a layoff at its internal studio, 31st Union, which it's interesting to even have a the word union in an internal studio, because I imagine 2K Games is not pro-union by any means, as they're laying off people. There is an argument, certainly, that internal studios like 31st Union might have had more to do with the development of games like Borderlands than they ever would really admit. It may also be a case that 31st Union had nothing to do with Borderlands in the past, but they were hoping that their internal studio might take over the Borderlands series, and that's fallen through. Officially, Gearbox is the people who made Borderlands, and 2K just was the publisher that owns the rights to it. That's the story they would stick to anyways. So I imagine there's no connection there at all, but that is pretty much my only thought as far as 2K. There are plenty of other 2K sports games and 2K published games that 31st Union may have had a hand in those, and I just wouldn't even care. It may be 31st Union had nothing on that. So overall, though, that just wraps up the story like every other announcement of layoffs, as far as some really unknown number of people have been laid off at some somewhat unknown studio, and there's just nothing you can really do about it unless you just want to boycott 2 games for laying off people, which, if that's your choice, that's your choice. But like, as an end user, as a gamer, I'm not really getting any information when these layoffs get announced, and I can't really take anything from it. I already am expecting delays from video games, so layoffs probably might delay some more games, but they probably won't delay as many games as you would think. They tend to almost always lay off people before they start a project or after they finish a project. They don't just make generic layoffs as they're getting money from publishers to develop a new game, which perhaps the death of E3 has hurt the situation in which game developers make pitches for new games to publishers, and thus there may be more publishers unwilling to fund the development of new games, and that may be leading to some of these layoffs also, but we really don't have a way of knowing anything. So let's just move on. We talked about Sega making more Web3 title-based games, Hellblade 2 being digital-only release, Rockstar editor losing last-gen support. And these should be all old stories as far as the Rocksteady co-founders opening a new studio. The indie developer Threx is shutting down after 15 years of developing the likes of Battle Planet and All I Have Is Time. Threx is definitively calling it quits later this year. I'm a little surprised we haven't seen more of this, where entire corporations and businesses shut down instead of just laying off people, but whatever. And undoubtedly by the end of this year there's going to be at least a few, if not quite a lot, of acquisitions and mergers and just companies trying to get more people on their payroll once again. Let's see, the GDC 2024 State of the Game Industry, devs discuss layoffs, generative AI, and more, which this is, I imagine, that survey that people have been referencing somewhat. The Lords of the Fallen developer CI Games is cutting 10% of jobs. The outsourcing studio Duelist got $2 million to create an original horror title. This is like, we really are getting very few positive news stories these days, and this is one of the few ones where somebody's being given a chance to make a game. Dead by Daylight developer confirmed layoffs also. Harmonix ending Rock Band 4 weekly DLC drops to focus on Fortnite Festival. And then Bethesda is returning to mobile with the Elder Scrolls Castles. I feel like this game has been out in beta for a while. Yeah. It's only available in the Philippines at the moment. Oh, maybe I'm thinking of a different game. Pre-registered experiment, basically. And then Sony's making an Until Dawn movie. And then that would bring us to the fall list cleanup, but then something about my fall list cleanup code has gone wrong, because the fall list actually did load, but it didn't open any new tabs after it, so there's still some room for improvement there. Anyways, even though we've gone long today, it's not that long, only about 35 minutes over 3 hours. So yeah, this new system, more curated system, seems to work a little bit better about not droning on too much. That's going to be it for this stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos.